All right, we still got some people trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover today. We're going to go around and do some quick introductions, and then we're going to dive right into covering our topic today, which is both sides of the draft, how content leaders at companies and freelancers can really work together to create expert content. So my name is Anna. I am a freelancer and have been a freelancer for several years. I have worked with quite a few different companies, including working with Ryan when he was at Gorgias. So I am going to turn it over to Ryan and let him intro himself.
Thank you, Anna. Hey, everyone. I'm Ryan Baum. I have worked at content programs like Helixa and Gorgias, was the first content hire both times, and at Gorgias had the chance to build out a full team. It was my first time in a management position, and now I'm consulting and have been doing that since the end of last year. So I'm working with a few clients trying to kind of figure out my offer. And as Anna mentioned, we had a successful working relationship at Gorgias. She was one of our most successful freelancers. I learned a lot from working with her, and we've kind of been continuing that process in the DMs ever since. And so that is what spurred this webinar on. Actually, we came up with it and pitched it to Letter Drop because we were like, we want to do this. Y'all are the perfect partners. And so I'll hand it off to Zach from there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ryan. I've known Ryan for about a year now, and he was leading content at Gorgias, and I lead growth at Letter Drop. Our company helps content leaders like a lot of you on this call, even on the freelance side, like Anna, just really work together, have more of a symbiotic relationship, not have to bounce from all these different documents, Asana, Airtable, all that. Just consolidate that process of creating great content in one platform, and I'll be here in the background and blowing up the chat too.
Awesome.
Love it.
All right. So how we're going to conduct this webinar, we have a couple of different parts. To start with, Ryan and I are going to kind of interview each other and talk a little bit, me asking Ryan about what a content team might be looking for in a freelancer, for those of you who are freelancers in the audience. And then Ryan asking me as a freelancer, what would I want from a partnership with a company for those of you who are on content teams? So we can kind of cover both sides of that. Then we're going to dive into some best practices from both of our experiences, what we've seen that works really well. And then we're going to get into a Q&A. We got a couple of questions in advance. And then if you have a question for either Ryan or myself, you can drop it in the chat and we'll address those at the end. So we're going to start with me asking Ryan some questions, and specifically from his experience at Gorgias, which is where he and I first met. So Ryan, how did Gorgias decide as a company that they wanted to work with freelancers in addition to the internal content team?
Yeah, so essentially what happened, a little bit of context and background, when I joined Gorgias in 2021 in December, I was the first content hire. So they had worked with a freelancer, a growth manager, and they'd done some content in the past, but I was the first dedicated person to really focus on that with a background in content. And so essentially the first 6 months we worked with an agency, 10 Speed, who was really helpful and got a lot of content with me up on the blog. And then I was able to make the case from that success to hire Jordan Miller, who was our first content editor. And so that's when a lot of things really changed, because I always say Jordan 2x, 4x'd our output, even though he 2x'd our headcount, both because he was faster and better than me at editing, but also because we could focus in. And that's when we started working with freelancers, because it was Jordan basically worked through a backlog for 2 months, I think, after he started. That was posts that we had finished but had not had time to fully edit, and we had them basically indexed in Google but hidden from the blog. So they were gaining, but they were not super visible. And so once he kind of caught up on that backlog and we were ready to start creating new content, it was very clear to us that we wanted to work with freelancers. And the reason for that is that we found that working with freelancers, we were able to get to a better output in terms of the draft, because we were able to work directly with them, right? And I think agencies can play a really important part of content programs in general. And I worked with OGM at the end, and they were also super helpful. But I have personally had a better success rate with freelancers because people like you can work with us long term, get direct feedback in the drafts. It was just something that we knew we wanted to do. And so that's kind of where we shifted. And from that point on, like even when we worked with OGM, they were helping us with SEO, and we did all of the content in-house with Jordan and our other editor, Alexa. And yeah, honestly, like I think to answer your question in like one short sentence, we realized that the thing that we were really good at was creating really high quality content. And it didn't make sense to fully outsource that to anyone. And we wanted to be more in control of that process. And so like, that's how we made the decision.
So how did Gorgias go about finding freelancers? Because I think that's a question, especially for freelancers that are on this call. They want to know, how can they connect with great companies that are looking for freelancers? So how did Gorgias go about like finding and sourcing freelancers?
Yeah, so we sourced almost entirely from our own networks and mostly with people we had worked with before. So Jordan had worked with some of them, including you, at Animals. Alexa had worked with Fedeke at Shopify. I had worked with Tina and was friends with her and like knew her work. And then we had a couple people. We had put out a call at one point on Superpath trying to scale, and we got some really good writing candidates. There was also a lot of noise that we had to work through, but we did end up working with a few people from that and found some really like dark horse, I would say, candidates that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. But yeah, generally we tried to work with people that we had experience with and like that it was good experience. And what I will say is like someone asked on one of the posts I put up last week, like, how do I get on this list, if we haven't worked together? And I have recommended a few freelancers that I haven't worked with to other people. So like Bonnie Kaur, for example, I've recommended because I see her work on LinkedIn. Like I know she can do what she can do. And I've also gotten recommendations for people that I trust who have worked with her. So like that is my backup. If someone that I know and trust can't take the project or it doesn't make sense for whatever reason, I will go to my network and tap people. And I feel like that is one of the most constant content questions I get from other content leaders is like, who do you know that you can recommend to write for us? And so I know I've recommended you to people after we worked together, and that's been successful. And so like, that's kind of the point of these long-term relationships. Like I know editors who have like a bench of freelancers that they take with them from company to company, and they don't like mandate that the person stops working with the company when they leave, but like generally they have enough work for that person at the next company. And so on both sides, I think there's a lot of benefit to kind of carrying on these long-term relationships over time.
So you mentioned that you had, this kind of, when you did put out a call, you had this pool of freelancers, plus you had some within your network. So what do you look for when you're trying to assess like this freelancer is going to be a good fit for us?
Yeah. So thinking purely in terms of like upfront, I'm trying to figure out if we want to work with someone. I would say like a thread that's really important. And we saw this also with our in-house writers. I don't think it's like super different. The ability to think clearly and communicate like a good idea clearly. It's rare, even among content writers, unfortunately. And that was really the deal breaker, especially in-house when we hired Christelle, who was brilliant. But it also comes into our freelancer relationships because we had personally really fantastic editors who really did not miss in terms of like fixing things. So I wasn't super concerned about that in terms of like perfect grammar, perfect prose, whatever. I also think like, I don't know if this happened when you were still with us, Anna, freelancing, or if it was after, because I know you didn't work with us the whole time, but we had like a freelancers channel. And one time I was literally like, I don't care if it's perfect. I don't even care if it's perfect when it goes up. Like, make it interesting, make it good. I don't care where the commas are on the draft, and neither does the reader, right? So I think not every content leader would have the same answer as me, but for me, it's like the things that are untrainable, like the ability to understand and grasp a concept, to communicate it clearly, to simplify it, that kind of like synthesis and communicating it clearly. Like you can teach it, but you have to be like an English teacher. Like I'm not confident in my ability to teach that. So I try to find writers who already have that, and then kind of the rest we can work with.
Yeah. And so what once you bring on a freelancer, what makes them great to work with, in your opinion?
First thing is consistency. And I would say that applies in general, but also to all the things I'm going to mention next. Someone who's just like super reliable. I think this happens in-house too. Like you want someone to be reliable. I always say like when you have a boss, you're either making their life harder or easier at any given time. And like any managing up advice is in one of those two buckets. Like it just is. Even being like friendly and they like you, that makes you easier to work with. And so when you're a freelancer, like essentially whoever you're reporting into, whoever's paying your invoices is your boss, right? For that client. And anytime my freelancers can make my life easier is huge, right? So consistency, being reliable with deadlines. And again, like you don't have to make every deadline, but communicating in advance, not only like why you can't make it, but also, you know, giving us enough time to like account for it. And the why doesn't have to be like, I ran into a thorny, unsolvable problem. It could be like, my kid is sick, like life happens, but we need to be able to know. And I think sometimes I've seen freelancers wait to share that. And I think it's like, either they are trying to be optimistic, like they're going to get it done and then they don't, or there's like a fear or shame in not being able to come to the content leader. And I think like we have to set that tone, right? Like my freelancers all came to me because they knew it was safe. Not everyone sets that environment, but we've had people like ask for extensions where they didn't even start it and it was the day of the deadline. And I'm like, that is avoidable and shouldn't happen. So I think all of those things and just like feedback, being able to take feedback really well. I think honestly, that's actually one of my like in-house tips too. I don't even think being unable to complete the job is necessarily a deal breaker, but unable to grow from feedback and like keeping the same mistakes happening in your drafts is a much bigger problem for me. So like, for example, earlier when we were working with you, Anna, we had more feedback because you were still learning the way we did things, but like very rarely did we give you the same feedback twice, right? And so I think that is super important. And that applies not only in draft, but also just in general. Like we told you we wanted you to push back more. You said not all content leaders like that, but then you did it on every other draft. And it was something that was really helpful in our relationship. So I think, and communication, I guess. So all of those things and do them consistently and you'll be a favorite, because there are a lot of freelance writers. There are not a lot of impressive freelance writers, unfortunately. And so I don't think the bar is so high that people can't reach it, but I also don't think it's that high to jump over for people who really try.
So if we take that and kind of turn it around, what questions do you have for me about working with a client and kind of setting that relationship?
Yeah. So the first one is like, what are the green flags that you look for when you're kind of working with a new client or considering if you want to work with a new client? Yeah.
So you talked about, what do you look for in a freelancer? So, a lot of times I'll do a call with clients ahead of time. And so one of two things either needs to happen. Either they'll ask me about my process because they want to understand like how I work and that I can deliver work. And so that to them shows that they want to, basically suss out if I'm reliable. Like, do I have a process in place for managing work? Especially if they don't have great internal processes, which is fine, but then they need to understand what my process is. Or I need to understand that something in a call that they trust me, that they trust me to get work done. If they come across as scattered, like, hey, we need a freelancer, but we've never worked with a freelancer before, and we're not quite sure what this should happen, that can work if they let me take the reins because I've been a freelancer for a long time.
Right.
But it also might not work. It might not work because they don't know what to expect from a freelancer and they don't know what that working relationship would look like. So that would be a red flag for me.
That's super interesting because I feel like what I heard from that is that you want to be vetted properly, where some people would be like, oh, I want them to just like,
hire me.
I want to, yeah, exactly. And I know that it feels like that, but I can see what you're saying where the benefits of being vetted properly is that that they know what they're doing. It's almost like a bit of a dance, right? In kind of sussing each other out, like any job interview should be, even in-house. The people don't always treat it like that. Yeah. So my follow-up question to that would be, why should content leaders care about showcasing those green flags, making that good first impression. Like, obviously, some of them will care that the freelancer is happy and feels supported, but let's appeal to their self-interest for a second. Outside of that, why should they care?
Yeah. So I think you mentioned job interviews, and it's not, all that different. I think in some cases from applying for a full-time job, in that I want to make sure that I'm successful, and I want to make sure that this is going to be a relationship that can be long-term. I'm happy doing short-term relationships and doing, like a one-off project for clients. I do that quite a bit. But also, if I get kind of a bad vibe during that initial call, I might not take the client. I mean, really good freelancers are in a place where they don't have to take all of the work. And so I might just decline the project altogether. So I think that's why that initial call is really important, to kind of say, hey, this is what we both expect from the relationship, and this is why it's going to be good for both of us. And I see that Ryan dropped off the call, so hopefully he will pop right back. Oh, here he comes! Yay!
He's back. There he is.
We're perfect.
I'm on a different camera. My main webcam just stopped, and it isn't getting recognized anymore. So now I'm on my laptop camera. So hello, everyone.
Yeah, Ryan and I were talking about this right before this call, right before we started recording. We said, "Why this technology is just so hard, even in 2024."
In 2024, after years of remote work, we still don't have it figured out.
After years of it, we still struggle. So yeah, basically that I want it to be good. I don't want it to be a short-term relationship or one where nobody's happy. So that's why it's important for kind of both of us to communicate, like, how do we work? What do we expect from the relationship, and do that, up front.
Yeah, absolutely. I missed part of what you said, but I'm sure it was all good. And I think at the end of the day, this is a relationship, right? And that's what we really tried to push through this whole thing. And I think if either side lets that lapse, in the short term, the work is going to be worse. And in the long term, there won't be a relationship. And so I think, this constant search for freelancers, some people just have a lot of scale and can never find enough writers. But I do know people who have good writers and lose them over time, not even because they're doing something wrong, just because they go to clients they are more excited to work on or whatever. The more you can keep the people you trust, the less you have to go and source, which I think is a big part of that. And so when you push back, because this is something that you mentioned that not all content leaders like, but we loved it. Me and Jordan were like, more feedback because it was good, right? And it made the work better. How do you approach that kind of balance of whether or not a content leader wants you to push back, or an editor, and also how and when to provide that feedback?
So that really depends. Some clients will ask for an outline, and then if so, I will provide feedback at that stage and say, hey, I think maybe this could be structured a little differently, or I have some additional thoughts here. And in some cases, they just want me to go directly to draft, and there is no outline stage. And so then I will leave comments in the draft like, hey, I added this because of this. I added this because of this. What I think is important is identifying, does the client want feedback, that type of structural feedback or feedback on the idea as a whole, or not? And then it depends. I've had clients, like Gorgias was a great example, where it was very collaborative. Like, hey, let's try this, or hey, maybe not, and working with the editor on figuring that out. If the client's feedback is no, we don't want feedback, and then because of that, I don't feel good about the piece, that is really tricky as a freelancer to say, like, I'm providing this based on my expertise, based on my experience. And the client's like, we don't want it, or we're not willing to listen or consider it. That's hard. And so I think it's kind of identifying, like, how much feedback do you want from a freelancer? Are you open to it? Do you respect their expertise, especially if they can back it up? Especially if they can back it up and say, hey, I've seen this work really well somewhere else. And if not, just talk about that. Maybe that's not the right freelancer for you. that just may not be. If they're used to being really collaborative and you just would rather just give them something, then I think that's a different type of freelancer. And so that's really important to kind of establish also is, do you want the feedback or not? And that's that kind of or parameters around the working relationship.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there's like a lot of conversation around what makes a good freelancer, good client, bad client. But I think both in full-time and freelancer relationships, sometimes it's just not a fit, right? Like, I don't think it's this binary good or bad. And I've definitely, not personally, I love all the freelancers that I've worked with, but I've seen people hire someone that I trust and they just don't mesh completely. And people are reasonable, right? Like, those people wouldn't go in and say, I wouldn't hire them again, or like they're bad. It's just like they recognize there's a difference, right? And you just want to find something that feels good for both sides. So I think like, again, it comes back to this kind of topic of relationships that I think is kind of underutilized or like undervalued by both sides, or at least not thought about enough, because the work gets in the way as it does, right? So what are some, we're going to talk about these kind of best practices in a second that we both feel are like super important and foundational. But are there any things that you've had like a specific client do that other clients have not thought of, where you were like, I wish more of them did that? Like maybe even something that we didn't do at Gorgias. I feel like we had a strong process, but we can't think of everything.
I don't specifically remember if this happened at Gorgias. It may have, and I just don't remember. But I have one client that when I was really new, she said, what else can I do to support you? What else can I give you to make you successful at this? Do you need any additional research? I mean, this is a client that had shared a style guide and internal decks on their messaging. They shared so much with me. And she was so focused on what can we give you to make you successful. And actually just saw one in the comments too that I'll come back to in a minute. But, I think that's a big one, is like, how can we set you up for success? Because I know how to make a client happy, deliver stuff on time being a big one, like taking their feedback and things like that. But it's really rare that a client wants to know how I can be successful. And someone just shared in the chat, share the impact of your posts. That rarely happens. I rarely, unless I specifically ask, I rarely get any metrics or anything like, hey, I closed this deal because of your post, something like that. And that's helpful for freelancers because that's how we get other clients, is by being able to share success stories. And so, yes, I'll get clients that'll give me that if I ask. But a lot of, they typically don't just volunteer the impact.
Yeah, absolutely. That, I don't know if that was us or not, but that's definitely a big Jordan Miller like tenet of him being an editor, and Alexa definitely continued it when she came on board. It's like, we had a freelance writing channel, we had personal relationships with our writers. I think the channel both helped like bridge that gap and helped with responsiveness, what we'll talk about later, but also like you could see another freelancer asking questions, and that being like, we had a chance to show with action, not just with words, that we actually wanted pushback, that we actually wanted questions. And I think so much of it is like, even if content leaders have good intentions, they're busy. Freelancers see that, they don't want to add to their pile, and then it ends up adding more work to the pile because they have to go back and fix things later. Like, would always rather have thoughtful questions. Not all questions are thoughtful, but like good, thoughtful, helpful questions are always welcome. So yeah, that's super interesting. And I think like a really good point. And then what is something you've seen that you haven't, or what is something you haven't seen that you've always thought like, man, I wish programs would do this, and they haven't done it, or at least not to the extent that you wish they did? Let me have it.
And I think this really kind of feeds into our next topic, which is talking about like best practices, because there are a lot of things that you, Ryan, have identified as best practices, and you ran them by me, and I'm like, yes, I agree with those. And we're going to bring up a slide here with a bullet list of points of what happens. And a lot of companies do not get all the way through our entire list because really great relationships, I think, are uncommon, starting with even, paying a freelancer on time, or being reasonable with the expectations for turnaround time. Freelancers are typically working with multiple clients and they can't turn something around in a day or two or things like that. And we talked also about how a lot of that is on the client side because the client controls the relationship. They're the ones that are paying the bills of the freelancer. They're the ones that are basically the freelancer has to make them happy. And so we want to kind of get into that. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to talk on that more because we have some best practices and things that we think should happen in every kind of successful client freelancer relationship.
Yeah, and as a precursor, I put this on a comment for one of my posts this week, but I think it bears repeating. I got a couple DMs from people kind of like, oh, well, we're putting a lot of onus on us, the content leaders, with your posts and not a lot of responsibility on the freelancer. And to that, I would say, like, we can only, as content leaders, control one half of that. And so that's the half I'm focusing on. But also, I do think the onus should be more on us. Like, we have a power dynamic. When I'm paying you, I am essentially in that kind of boss role. And to me, it should be more my responsibility to make sure the relationship is successful, that I'm checking in to make sure that you're good and that everything is going well. Like, of course, it's always helpful when a freelancer can pick that up and be a part of that conversation. But if they're not, that does, in my opinion, fall on our side of the equation. So all that to say, we've identified kind of like 5 best practices or like dimensions of a successful freelancer relationship. And I've thought about these from like the content leader side, but I think Anna's really aligned that like she would like to see this and that more freelancers would like to see this in companies. And so what we have is like payment in general, but especially on time. Reasonable, which basically is like, you're asking for things that are reasonable. Your timelines make sense. I actually put a checklist on LinkedIn today. To me, it's like scope and timeline and bandwidth. And I gave some checkboxes that, like, to me, you should be able to check all. I think there was like 11 of them. You should be able to check those all like consistently, not every single time, because things happen and like writers are reasonable. And I'm sure, Anna, at some point at Gorgias, we had to ask you to give us some slack because of something internally, and you were always cool about it. But hitting them frequently makes those whatever oopsie moments easier to stomach for the freelancer because they're not happening every single draft. And I would say the same thing about, freelancers being reasonable too. Like, you want to leave some slack on both sides of the relationship for things to go wrong, right? Respect, I think, is a big one. That's one that Anna actually added. I saw it under like some of the others inherently. And I think it's really important to call out because it's almost foundational, right? Like, if I see Anna as like a blog article machine that I'm paying for access to, like a vending machine, like, I'm not going to take her pushback with the same like seriousness. I'm not going to be as thoughtful with how I reach out to her and how I assign deadlines. Like, I had mentioned slack time on the post. Like, I truly believe that every deadline should have, like, if there's no room for error, if nothing can go wrong to hit that deadline, then you have a bad deadline, in my opinion, because like things do go wrong. Life happens. I think respect is kind of an inherent part of that. Responsiveness, again, that's probably one of the most two-sided things. Like, both people in that working relationship need to get back reasonably quickly, not necessarily within an hour, but like within 24 for sure. And it usually helps to kind of like set standards up front and communicate when you are going to take longer. So like a delivery received or delivery confirmed, anything like that helps a lot, just so that you as the freelancer are not like, okay, what's happening? And you have your other clients, of course, which I also think is part of reasonable, understanding that you are not working with a W-2 employee and you're not paying them and paying their benefits. And there are trade-offs that come with that. And then the last one is partner. And I think, like, I was telling you, Anna, if I had to choose one thing on this list to deprioritize, it would be partner, not because it's not important, but because the other 4 are like really, I think, deal breakers. And partnership is almost like the one that the least content programs are doing, in my opinion, which is like not only taking your pushback, but also what are you thinking about this piece, Anna? Or like, do you think there's a different keyword we can target? I've even started to see more of my freelance writing friends, especially content leaders who write on the side, getting access to the tools that the team uses, like Ahrefs, so you could push back against a brief with more, authority. So, we had talked about this earlier, and I think we said pay on time and reasonable is like 1A, 1B. Respect and responsive is like 2A, 2B. and partner is 3. And I think like if you can't do all of these, you shouldn't be doing anything else like automation, process, etc. If you can't do at least the first 4, you shouldn't be doing partner. And if you can't be doing the first 2, you shouldn't be hiring freelancers. Like full stop. If you can't pay them and take care of them, then you don't actually have the budget and bandwidth for freelance writers.
Right. And I'll add, specifically on kind of the reasonable and respect, I'll just give an example that I had come up with a client a couple weeks ago, where I had delivered an outline and the client gave me feedback on the outline. And then my final draft, we both realized that I had misinterpreted what she said. And she acknowledged that she understood how I misinterpreted what she said, and so she was reasonable and said like, hey, you delivered this because you interpreted it this way. I totally get why you interpreted it this way. Therefore, we need to push out the deadline to give you a chance to rework it. And we need to compensate you for the time that you put in, because it wasn't entirely on me that it had ended up that way. And so I think that type of thing is the reasonable aspect, that it's got to be both sides. Like if I've got to deliver what they asked for, and if I misinterpreted, that's on me. But if I also didn't get unclear direction, kind of that's on both of us. And so that fits into both reasonable and the respect part of the relationship.
Yeah, and I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule, right? If so, I'm going to ask you a few questions on these.
Yeah.
So I think of all of these, reasonable is the one that may be the toughest, and that's why I literally made a checklist for it, because I feel like it seems like it is subjective, and it is to a degree, but I think that there are objective kind of like bare minimum requirements. If someone like a content leader that you were working with, or actually even better, a content leader that you're friends with, so they're not paying you, asked you for advice on how to understand, am I being reasonable or not? How would you help them kind of work through and suss that out?
One, and I have to put this a little bit on the freelancer as well, or both, is to really identify the scope of the project. And so if something's outside of scope, if the client is asking for something outside of scope, they shouldn't be. But if the freelancer does it outside of scope, they need to be able to set that boundary as well. So one is really defining of scope. Like, do you want your freelancer to include a meta description? Like, that's something really small, but for the freelancer, it's extra time and extra word count. And so is that part of it or not? How many revisions are included? That's another example. Like if you keep asking for additional revisions, one, the freelancer should have something in scope, but 2, the client can't just keep asking for unlimited revisions, and particularly bringing in new stakeholders at each round of revisions, which I've had happen. So it's like the client has to understand that everything they're asking for is the freelancer's time. And the freelancer also has to be able to push back and have a good contract in place that says, this is what I will do and this is what I won't do. And if you want me to do something outside of that, this is what it's going to cost, just so that there's kind of understanding on both sides of what is reasonable. Turnaround time is a big one. Either the freelancer and the content leader have to come to an agreement that is within scope, like I will turn this around within X days. Or if there isn't that in place, then the content leader needs to understand that the freelancer is working with multiple clients. And so like a day's turnaround, a 2 days turnaround may not be possible. Just like working with, an agency or anybody outside of your internal content team. They have multiple clients. And so there has to be some kind of expectation about delivery. Either that's a discussion up front, or that's kind of an ongoing conversation about what is that. And on the freelancer side, I am super communicative with clients like, hey, here's my vacation. I will not be available for a week, and let them know weeks ahead of time if they're planning something that like I will not be available. Just like if I were internal, they have to be able to plan around that. And so that's on the freelancer side. How do you be reasonable in setting, like I cannot deliver anything during this time period?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I love that you focused on scope, because like I mentioned scope, timeline, bandwidth, but really like the scope is where all that comes together, right? And
Or
so,
falls apart. Or
yeah,
falls
yeah,
apart.
exactly, yeah, or should come together is, I guess, maybe the better way to say it. It is often where it falls apart, and I think it's the most important part of this. The first thing I'll say is like you did a good job of this at Gorgias. I just remembered I was going to give an example from my own consulting now, being on the other side of the draft, not writing, but like doing strategy and having deliverables in a set scope. There has been times where I will go out of scope a little bit. If it's like a small thing, it's not worth, adding to the contract, and I can do it for them as like a favor. But you actually, I think where I got this from originally is like you would give us extra revisions at Gorgias, but you'd be very clear that it was a favor that you were doing, a gift that was not in scope. And I think that's important because that's a really good stepping stone for people who don't feel comfortable being like, that's out of scope, I'm charging you if you want it. Just to say like, I'll do it, but let's be clear that that's not in scope, because I think the kind of insidious thing about scope creep is that you don't actually get credit for the creep because everyone just kind of thinks of it as part of the project. So being really clear where you're going above and beyond, even if it's something that you're doing on your side of your own volition out of scope, I think it's really important to be like, hey, we agreed on this because I care about our relationship. I'm taking this one step further. But like naming that, I think, goes a long way for both sides to kind of recognize the effort. I also think like a lot of people who think they have a scope don't have a scope. If it's not in writing, you don't have a scope. If everyone hasn't agreed on it before the project, you don't have a scope. And even if you do have a scope, like if it expands, if you're not respecting it, if you haven't clearly defined it, if it's kind of like morphing that's not a scope. Like the scope is essentially guardrails around the work that is meant to protect both sides. And when you lose track of that, either because someone can't access it or because you've never clearly documented it, then it becomes a he said, she said, which is objectively what scope is trying to prevent. Like it is supposed to be this kind of like objective source of truth. And so I think, even like you said, things that seem like they're too, specific, like the meta description, good to have. And I think you can even have like kind of a overarching scope where you're like, this is how we handle this type of project that you link in the doc, and then give the specific scope for that project. But I've never seen a freelancer stressed by over communication of expectations. Let me just put it that way. I'm sure that you could go too far, but in general, I find that freelancers are more wanting the context, wanting to hear more from you.
Yeah. And I'll add one more story from working with Ryan at Gorgias about kind of that falls into both reasonable or I should say respect and the partnership. I was given an assignment and told about it, and it was in December. It was toward the end of the year. We're all trying to go off the grid for the holidays. And I was told, hey, this piece is coming. We really want you to have this done before the end of the year. So I said, sure. I blocked off a day on my calendar for it. And it fell apart due to another employee at Gorgias. She just said, you know what, we're going to just wait till January. Well, I had actually turned down other work because I'd saved that spot for Gorgias. And that was my fault as a freelancer. I shouldn't have turned down work until I had a brief in hand. But I made Ryan aware of it, and he actually said, hey, we know that that's a loss of income for you. We're going to give you, if you want it, we're going to give you another piece in kind of a different area. But if you want this, we're willing to give you another piece to kind of round that out for the year. And so he didn't have to do that. I mean, that was my fault for planning on this piece that ended up falling through. But I think it really showed how much he respected the relationship with the freelancers and understanding that if a freelancer is counting on that income and it falls apart on their end, that try to do right by the freelancer.
Yeah, and I had forgotten that story when Anna replayed it for me recently, and I think it just goes to show that something that I felt was a given because it wasn't common and because it was important at that time to her, like really stuck with her. I think these are the ways that you build relationships, right? Big relationships built in very small, increments, drops in the bucket, as it were. And I think, and I love that story because I think I literally pretty sure I just pulled a piece from the next month and like just took it off the roadmap and gave it to you so that you had something to write. And then we had one less piece on the roadmap. So at the end of the day, it was a win for both of us. So appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear from Letter Drop. I saw Parthy drop something in the chat, and Zach or from you as well. Kind of what you think are, response to these best practices and what you see from content leaders.
Yeah, well, this has been very interesting. Thanks for inviting us on from the letter drop side. But I feel like everyone's on this call because you're either an expert in writing content or leading teams. Kind of both Anna and Ryan fit that bill. But we're on this call at Letter Drop because we've been lucky enough to work with and provide our platform to hundreds of content leaders that love and need what we do. 80% of our customers are using freelancers, and I bet some of them are using people on this call. You can go to our website and see that. But 90% of them are using multiple different softwares to manage that production process. So like a Google Docs, Asana, Airtable, SEMrush, Sprinkler for the social side. And I think to Ryan and Anna, your 2 points earlier, where being able to prove the ROI for freelancers, it's something that you can also track in LetterDrop, but just making that process efficient, the relationship healthy. A big part of that stems from, hey, what are you using on your side? What are we using? How can we make this relationship work? And those are two areas where we could potentially help some people on this call. I think we're going to throw our emails in the chat. So if you want to reach out, totally cool. Just to hang out and chat or learn more. Either way works for us. But yeah, I think all in all, what you all brought up is a relationship that we see from the outside, get to experience. And it was super interesting to kind of hear more of in the weeds of how it works and how we could really build our product to help that too.
Yeah, I saw Parthy put in the chat, like the stuff we're mentioning applies to any vendor, not just freelance writers, also freelance strategists, editors, agencies you work with, even SaaS vendors, especially at the stage that Letter Drop's at. Like Salesforce isn't really going to sweat your payment in the P&L, but Parthy will, and let's not do that to him. So I think all the things we're mentioning here make sense across the board, and they're just like courtesy in any working relationship, even probably in-house for most of them. One thing I will also say is, I bought Letter Drop. It was one of the last things I did before I left Gorgias. And I was really happy to see that they were able to still push it over the line with me leaving, because I saw most of the value of Letter Drop that I saw at the time was in this kind of like editorial process and the management of relationships, right? Because having one source of truth for docs and project management, and even like we had our content docs, I think we did a really good job of having like a really good style guide, really good content guidelines, even like a product overview. There are places in Letter Drop where you can actually put those things so that your writers have them handy, right? And they define clear steps of the editorial process where you can get notified when a writer turns their draft in. And like you can ping a writer when the draft is not in automatically, because I had very nice editors. And I do think that it was a problem for them when they had to like nag and bug. So having it automated, I think, was actually a really big like win. And just in general, the more that content tools put these kinds of soft skills and like the work around the work in the software, it's a reminder for the people that don't have their content docs to like go make them and put them in. So all in all, I think it's moving us toward a better kind of freelancer content leader relationship.
Awesome. Well, I am going to quick put up how you can get in touch with both Ryan and myself before we go into the Q&A, because we did get some questions in advance, and we did get a bunch of questions in the chat, so that information doesn't get buried at the very end of this webinar. Ryan, you can reach out ryanbaum.com. Me, you can reach out at annabeyang.com. And I think, and Zach just dropped his email in the chat, so that if you want to reach out to LetterDrop, you can do that as well. But we put out a call for questions in advance, and we did get a couple, and then we have seen a couple questions come through the chat, so we're going to answer those. But I'm going to start with, for Ryan, a question that came through. And how do you determine the quality of an editor's work? Because I worked with an editor at Gorgias. I worked with Jordan, and that really kind of changed the dynamic, I think, of that freelancer relationship, is having an editor kind of sit in between. That's not the case of all my clients. And so how do you determine kind of like that editor is kind of, I don't want to say worth what they're doing, but like how do you determine that they're contributing to that content process? Okay,
so from my side as a content leader, like how I would judge people that are reporting into me as editors.
Like I guess how would you judge internally? If you were at Gorgias, how do you determine that yes, you need an editor, and that editor is doing what you're expecting them to do?
Okay, so I will take it from, I guess there's like a couple different angles. The first one being like the quality of the in-draft feedback, right? Like the ability to improve a piece and work with the writers. So I had incredible editors. I've already shouted them out, but Jordan Miller and Alexa Hertel were both fantastic, absolutely both better than me at editing. And that's actually something I look for. Like I won't hire anyone who's not better than me at the thing they do, especially at like that level. Happy to scream from the rooftops that both of them are better and faster editors than me. And I think one of the things that they were both really good at is moving quickly through a draft and being able to prioritize what actually mattered to spend time on, right? And I think with our editorial process, it was like we'd have like a really strong brief, and then it would go to the freelancer. So like Anna would send us back a draft. They would give like really high level developmental feedback, very little in the weeds like copy editing. Maybe we would like there was a couple of cases where we had like a writer who kind of struggled with passive voice, for example. They would take like 1 or 2 paragraphs and really highlight all the cases of passive voice, but it's for the purpose of like a larger piece of developmental editing. And then the freelance writer would get it back to kind of like, okay, this whole section needs to be revised, for example, or like we're going to switch the order of these two and you're going to have to make that transition a little smoother or whatever it is. But I think it prevents us from spending a lot of time nitpicking over things that are going to get cut out fully from the draft or change entirely. And so, I think my biggest fault as an editor is like I'm slow. So that was always what was really impressive to me about them is like their ability to just go in and be like really incisive and spend more time than a lot of editors would on specific things that were actually priority and ignore other things that pedantic editors might get really in the weeds about when it wasn't, you know what I mean? Like a huge thing. And often we would do like final, proofreading edits last, like it wasn't something we did with the freelancers. Maybe we would share it with them so they could see on like suggest mode. But, so that's kind of like the in draft part of it. Also, like every good editor I've ever known, and Jordan was the first one I saw do it, but I've seen it a lot since then. I think it's also an animals thing, which is just like super helpful. But summarizing at the top of the draft, like, okay, I've left comments throughout. I've highlighted specific things, but there are things that are like at a high level where no comment in the draft will make sense. There's also places where we have 5 comments. I'm going to summarize how all of those kind of fit together. Not only having that overview is super helpful, but having it at the top where it's the first thing the freelancer reads and kind of contextualizes all the specific edits is such a game changer and something that I have started doing that I didn't before that I really love. And then I would say on my side, like internally as someone who managed editors, just like being able to trust them. I was at the point where Jordan and Alexa ran our editorial process. Jordan ran it by himself before Alexa was there, and then Alexa joined him and they did it together. I would look at our pieces for the most part before they went out, but very rarely did I provide like in-depth feedback because they were good and I trusted them, and reliably I never had anything worth spending a ton of time nitpicking about, to the point where Jordan actually came to me once in one of our one-on-ones and was like, hey, I want feedback on my editing and I want it like very clearly and I want to like spend an hour and do that. And we did. And of course there were things I could find that I would improve or I would do differently, and that was helpful to him. But being able to trust that if Jordan edited a piece, I didn't have, like if I had a busy day, I didn't have to look at it. There were 100% blogs monthly that went out on Gorgias that I would see after they were published and read them then and feel great about my decision to just let them go. And at some point you become a blocker. So having that trust is super important to keep the process moving.
Yeah. Here's another question that we got in advance before we go to the questions in the chat. And I think, Ryan, you had some thoughts about this, and I have some as well. But what's the right balance between in-house and freelance writers, especially when you're talking about that ROI, scaling, anything like that?
You want to go first? I have a lot of strong opinions on this.
I have to cough, so if you could go first, that'd be great.
Okay, I can go first. So yeah, I saw a post on this recently that the thesis of the post was basically like, we don't need in-house content writers, which I like couldn't disagree with more. There's probably some programs that get away with it, but like even at Gorgias, before we had Christelle as an in-house content writer, like Jordan was writing in-house, like it wasn't like we were never doing, I was writing in-house even sometimes for like web copy. So, I think that there is a balance. I think outsourcing super important, especially these days. I think programs that rely more on SEO, especially when they are doing more of like generous reading, the traditional playbook of SEO, where there's not a lot of necessarily attention paid to like SME and quality and unique perspectives. you could probably get away with outsourcing a lot of that. But I do think that at certain level, it's almost like you as an in-house person, writer, or any other type of position, you get the business and what's happening in your bones. As a freelance writer, Anna, you really understood what we were doing, even though it wasn't your area of like fintech expertise. But you also weren't in our internal content meetings. You weren't in our Gorgias all hands meetings. You weren't seeing product updates in Slack coming directly from the engineering team. Like, there are just things that at the very least, you absolutely need some sort of in-house editor, some eyes on the article before it goes out. And like, even though there was probably entire categories like SEO content for us that we mostly outsourced, Christelle was so key for things like we did like a B Corp certification, and there was a bunch of comms around that. And she understood from the people team what they wanted, how they wanted to position it. She understood the culture of Gorgias, even being there for only like 4 or 5 months, and like why certain things were important to mention. We're very data driven. Like, that's not something you would have known as a freelancer inherently. And so, yes, absolutely, freelancers, super valuable. Agencies can be valuable, but there is something to be said for having that at least one person in-house who can take those tough kind of amorphous pieces and whip them into shape with all of that kind of knowledge of the business.
Yeah. And I'll add to that, and you alluded to that also, Ryan. So when I was writing for Gorgias, I was actually writing very product-heavy content. So very product-heavy. In retrospect, that may not have been the best fit for a freelancer, just because I am not, for exact reasons you said, I'm not in the product day in and day out. And I wasn't in the internal communications around how do our customers use this, And so I think it was fine for me because I came from a product background. And so I actually asked for access to the product and got in there and like played with it myself to figure out how that works. But that probably would have been a really good fit for an in-house person who like can be like in that product and really understand like this is how our customers are using it and this is how we're talking about it. And I write for some other product companies, and sometimes like I am a user of the product. I write for Zapier, for example. I use Zapier all the time, so I'm comfortable writing about that type of stuff. But I think, when you're trying to show use cases and things like that, those are probably a really good fit for internal. But I also do, customer stories and case studies, and I can do those as a person who's comfortable interviewing. That might not be a good fit, just time-wise or for whatever, for an internal team, or if the the freelancer is good interviewing, that's a really good use case for a freelancer, and you get all these amazing, case studies out of it.
Yeah, that's super interesting context, actually, because it is both, to your point, a bad example of this and a great example of this, right? Because at the time, we didn't have an in-house writer. Absolutely, that would have been something that would go to an in-house writer. Like, if that had happened at the end of my tenure, Christelle would have probably gotten those posts, right? And worked with the product team directly. But at the time, it was just me and Jordan. I don't even think we had Daryl on the team at that point. And, we had, Alexa was freelancing for us before she was an editor, and she literally worked at Shopify. And Anna was very clear she did not have e-commerce background, but we gave you that piece because we knew that you had the product mindset, that you would go and find the answers. The fact that you asked for the product was a huge green flag. Like, if the client doesn't give you the product access, that's a red flag. If the freelancer doesn't ask for it, that's a red flag, in my opinion. Like, even just at the beginning when you're onboarding, you should get a feel for the product. At the very least, watch some really meaty product walkthroughs on YouTube of what you're writing about. But like, if your SEO content is product led, and it should be, you need that. But that was like a conscious choice at the time to give it to you because you had the seniority and the experience in that space to write about it. So kind of goes both ways in a way.
Yeah. And that's interesting that you mentioned, giving product feedback. I have another client that I'm still working with, and they wanted me to go through almost some of the same internal training that they gave to new hires. And so they had a series of videos, and they said, we want you to watch these. And on top of wanting me to watch all these videos, which I was happy to do, they said, we're going to pay you for your time. So they recognized that to bring me up to speed and have me watch several hours worth of internal videos to really understand the product. But that also was some of my time, and that was worth something to them to have me go through that process.
I want to say we did that too. I don't want to, I can't promise that, but I'm pretty sure that's something Jordan really advocated for. There was like a certain point where we were having certain writers do a lot of product led stuff. And yeah, we made them go through like our help docs or something. And we paid them basically for each hour that they spent doing that. We gave them like 10 hours to go through it, and we paid them for those 10 hours. And I felt like that was a really good investment for the reasons that you mentioned, because we all want freelancers to do that, but it's kind of hard to expect them to kind of like do that in their free time. It's not leisure activity. And it's not going to happen. Right? Like, it's not going to happen to the depth that you want if you're not paying for it.
Well, and it's the same as like hiring a new employee, right? You do that after they're on the payroll, not before they're on the payroll, right?
Exactly.
So, exactly, you're compensating them for their time.
Yeah.
A couple of questions we had in the chat, and some of them are related, but one of them is you ask for writers' references, and then another one is asking writers to do a sample.
Writer references is a tough one. I've always had the reference before I hired them. Like I mentioned with my like how we hired freelancers, the reference was why they were coming to work for us. But if I was hiring someone brand new, if I knew someone that had worked with them and I could get an easy backdoor, yes, I would probably not call references that I had never met to vet someone. But to your point, that's because we did samples. So in my opinion, you should always start every freelancer relationship with exactly one piece, and it should be paid full price, right? So even if the freelancer is like, and we didn't have this problem because we knew the freelancers we were working with, but even if it was like a cold freelancer, I think we had at least one where we were like, we did one post and we were like, no more. But you can still use that post. It's not like it's worthless to the business. Jordan would clean it up or whatever it was. And that is actually the best way to get a feel for someone's work. It brings up things that you just can't in an interview. And actually, something I said after we hired Christelle, and I never had a chance really to hire another writer, is like, I would do the same thing with an in-house writer. I think that the test that we did, while aligned with the kind of work you would do in-house, we would have been better off paying those writers to do a freelance piece. And we would have seen more clearly how the whole draft came together. Because like in our writing test for in-house writers, we didn't feel comfortable asking for an entire article, especially one that we were going to use without paying for it. So we basically tried to cut out pieces of that process and test them individually. So it was like less than 2 hours. I would have rather paid them the $1,000 to get a full piece. And, you know, you're investing. It's so funny to me. We spend like 3 hours talking to people before hiring them and maybe working with them for years. Like, I don't think there's enough paid work that you can do that is overkill, as long as it's fairly paid and like makes sense for what you're doing.
Coming up on time, we are going to stay on for a couple of extra minutes and finish going through some of these questions. But if you have to jump, you have to jump, and we get it. I'll answer that on the freelancer side. I don't think I've ever been asked for references per se. But I also collect testimonials like candy. Like I will reach out to clients and while I'm still working with them or after the relationship, and ask them to write a recommendation on my LinkedIn profile. And then I will take that recommendation and put it on my website. And like, that's proof by itself. Like any client, if they want to know, I can say here's the people that have been happy working with me. As far as writing samples, I don't do unpaid writing samples, as Ryan pointed out. The work should be paid, particularly if you intend to use it. But in any case, it should be paid. I actually make clients sign a full agreement with me, like we were moving forward, because most of my work is ad hoc anyway. So if they want to stop working with me after one piece, they can. They're not tied into a long retainer. But then it is exactly the same format, treating that first piece like it's the start of the relationship. And so that ends up being a sample, or it ends up being the first of many pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I phrased it the way I did is like, we would not sign an ongoing contract with someone until that first piece was good. We would have something in place to pay them and all of that. And we did get paid even if it wasn't good, obviously. But once it was good, once we were set, that's when we would like fully basically onboard them as a freelancer. And I mean, like, that was specific to us because I mean, we never worked with more than like 7 or 8 freelancers at once the entire time I was there, because all of them wanted more work from us, and we're good and we're taking consistent work. And like, I wish I had the budget to keep more than 8 freelancers on retainer, but I did not. But yeah, honestly, I just looked at your LinkedIn profile because I was wondering if we did one. I didn't remember doing it. And Jordan was the one that had left your recommendation. And I remember him reaching out and getting feedback from me on how to make that better. Makes me want to go write recommendations for our other freelancers that I love that I didn't think to do that for. So I guess that's an advice for content leaders to give them, that shine. I also think like it's so funny to me. I've had people when I was at Gorgias working with freelancers, I would recommend them to other companies and people would be like, you're going to like recommend me your best freelancer. And I'm like, yeah. And it kind of reminds me of the conversation around employee advocacy. Like if they're good and you're doing it right, people are going to want to poach them. You doing stuff like that, treating them well is what makes them stay, not what makes you lose them, right? And we were very clear, like we never wanted to have. We did with Alexa at the end before she got hired full time, 40-hour contract a week. But like in general, I never want any freelancer to be a single point of failure because you're not a W-2 and you can't make that kind of commitment. And so I never want to give a freelancer more than like 25 hours of work a week, even if they're like, ready for it, just because then you get sick or you have a sick kid. And now instead of one piece being behind, we have like four, So I think that is just another example of kind of spreading that out and making sure you understand like what's going on.
Yeah. We've got one more question I want to make sure we tackle. It's from Parthy and it's got kind of Parthy from Letter Drop. It's got kind of two sides. How should content leaders make an internal business case for freelancers to show the ROI? And then on my side, I'll answer the second part of the question, which is what can freelancers do for content leaders to make the business case obvious? So Ryan, if you want to tackle the first part of that.
Yeah, I have an answer. I don't like it, but I have an answer. In my experience, the only way really has been like do it and then make the case that adding X resources will shift the curve. So like I inherited an agency at Gorgias. I doubled traffic in 6 months. I went to my boss and I was like, hey, go get me a Jordan and I'll give you more, all of that and more. And that's how I got the case for Jordan. And then when Jordan was killing the backlog and rushing through all of those pieces and we started to see results from that, I was like, but wait, there's more. What if we had freelancers? And so I think it's kind of like an incremental shift in the budget. I personally have not been able to make a case for more budget without that kind of like leading indicator on the work that's already being done. If anyone knows how, shoot me an email because I would love that magic formula. What I will say is that I underused projections at the start of my Gorgias journey. And so like the way I made the case for OGM was literally mapping like, okay, if we keep on the trend we're doing now, here's where we're at. If we can make these changes, here's where I think we can go. And that growth curve. And it was like literally like a keyword level analysis that I did with SEO Monitor, which made it easier to do that. But like, that's how I got the budget. And it was like not insignificant budget, but I showed, hey, I've thought about this and I have like actual numbers. It's not just like a trust me, bro, in asking for 20K a month of budget.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, Ryan, I see this on our side too, because people try and fight to get budget for Letter Drop. I think going to your boss and saying, hey, bro, I need more resources doesn't work. But what typically does, at least from what we see with content leaders and teams, is tying what you're trying to do on the content side to an overall business objective or marketing goal. So if your marketing goal that is, hey, we need 200 MQLs this month. Okay, how is hiring Anna and getting her to write 2 more pieces of content for us this week going to help tie into that? At Letter Drop, we have software that helps you, tie what you're doing to revenue, which is probably for more of the content team, right? Being able to track if a page somebody reads one of your blog pages, that ends up leading to somebody booking a demo and then converting to a closed won deal. We track the revenue. But I think when you're originally trying to build that business case, it's like, okay, let's tie in Anna or freelancer insert resource to an overall marketing business goal. And then we've seen that work pretty well in terms of getting funding.
Hey, the sales perspective on that is perfect because that's usually what the kind of thinking that a VP is doing. Also, I would add, like, if you're trying to get budget for software or an agency or like a freelancer, like, so if I knew Anna was going to be a freelancer I hired, let's say I go to another company, I'm like, okay, she's on my list of trusted freelancers. I'd want to bring her on. If I was like really having a VP who's on the fence, I would use Anna as a partner and bring her into that discussion what are some pieces that you've written that are really good that I can show him that show quality? What are some pieces you've done that have like really changed rankings so I can make the case? Can I have you on the phone with him so he can see that you're a smart and driven person? Like, you know what I mean? Like all these things, there is a quantitative element to it, but sometimes, I mean, actually not sometimes. Quantitative results is a proxy for trust with vendors. And if you can get them to trust without the quantitative results, they're not actually necessary. I've been on this rant lately about like logo reels and portfolios. Haven't been asked for a single one since I started consulting. And it's because all of them are inbound. They already trust me because someone went hard for me before we had that conversation. So Anna, if I went to you and I was like, okay, I really want to bring you in. I think we're close. How can you help me get this over the line without offering a discount? Because I don't think that's the answer.
No. And I have a couple thoughts on making the freelancer making the business use case. And a lot of times it's made for me because that person already does, it's inbound and the person already kind of knows me and trusts me. But a couple things that I think that I do to complement a team is one, I work with a lot of very small companies and they just don't have the budget for a full-time content hire. And then they'll have an internal content leader who understands strategy and understands what needs to happen. They just need somebody to execute. And that doesn't need to be a full-time person. They're just not there yet. And so that is a really good business case for a freelancer is I can complement your internal content leader and strategist. The other one, and I think kind of Ryan, probably more where you were coming from with Gorgias, is I need to scale this thing. And I need to be able to get a ton out to a bunch of different freelancers who all may have different skill sets, or I need an expert in this particular area. And that's, I have very specific expertise in financial technology and product technology. And sometimes that might be a hard role to hire for. And you want to hire a writer who can do either more broad things or focus very narrowly on the product side, something like that. And so that's a case where a freelancer can also complement a team, is that you can bring them in for very specific niches or things like that. And that's a business use case also where it's like, hey, I need someone who really can nail this one piece and we need the person to do that. I have a client that I write very specific content for that involves interviewing 5 different people for every single piece. It's kind of a collaborative thing. That's just something that's a drain internally. They can't do it. And so they outsource those projects to me because I can do it. So that's another kind of ROI thing is we know this is important. We don't have it internally. So but we can use a freelancer for that.
Yeah. And we talked earlier about like fit, how you don't have to be like bad freelancer, good freelancer. It's like freelancer that fits our needs. I think that's something that more content leaders and like I can even look back at my time at Gorgias and think about examples where I could have done this better. Thinking about that fit from the jump, right? I was talking to a friend recently who's like starting her consulting practice and she was looking for a freelance writer for only 20 hours a week. She's like, no one that wants full-time is going to want this because it's 20 hours. Freelancers aren't going to want this big of a chunk because then they are blocked off from doing other clients. And I was like, thinking about you and me, Anna, we're both working like 20, 25 hours a week right now, like half time. And for some people, that's a dream, right? Could be a mom coming back from mat leave and she wants to ease back in, or like someone like you who like could have all of her eggs in one basket for a little bit. So you don't have to worry about pitching and going back and forth between clients. Like it just depends. You do fintech content and you're really good at it. That sounds like my nightmare, honestly. Like that is not my specialty to just do that full time. But with you, it's an advantage because you have a niche. So I think it's just like understanding that there is sort of like a writer for every scenario, right? Like there are content leaders I know who like to do like one, freelance writing thing on the side at a time, like one article at a time, and then they take the next one. Someone out there needs one really senior article a week and they're filling that need. So I think at the end of the day, it's just like, if it works for both people in that freelancer content leader relationship, then it works. And so we already let people jump off. I do have one more question for you, Anna. Something I was thinking about while you were doing that. A lot of bad freelancer pitches out there. And a lot of them are really consistent in a way that tells me that someone out there is giving really bad advice and should lose his internet connection. And so, but not enough talk about what is a good freelancer pitch, right? So I have thoughts, but I'm curious if you've actually gone and pitched cold or like how you would approach that to make it more effective. Because sometimes it's necessary, right?
I am not the right person to answer this because I'm actually terrible at pitching, but I'll say that the reason for that is because I network with people.
Yes.
So I'm almost never cold pitching. Even working with Gorgias was first going to Jordan and then Jordan introing me to you, Ryan. Yep. And it was because I saw the link on Superpath that you put out there. You're like, hey, we need somebody at Gorgias. I'm like, I raised my hand. I went to Jordan. I went to you. So I'm not pitching myself in the same way because I'm using an existing relationship. And that is almost all of my client work at this point is either inbound or networked. And so I'm terrible at answering, like, how do you pitch people? Because I don't know. It's usually like, hey, I knew you from here.
Yeah. So let's take a different approach then. I think don't cold pitch is good advice, actually. And, in your example, I didn't know who you were when we started working with you, but I would have, even 2 months into Jordan's tenure, followed him into war and did. And so for him to be like, not only is Anna a good writer, but like I fully trust her and would vouch for her was enough for me. I don't even think we did a sample. I think we were just like, please help us. We need help. But I do think that like all the people that have successfully pitched me as a freelancer, and I mean successfully as in I forwarded their information and we like spent time looking at their work. That doesn't mean that we necessarily hired them. It just depended on our bandwidth and other things. But they all had some sort of, I knew of them. They were around on LinkedIn, or they were like, hey, like, I think one of the only cold pitches I got that was really effective was like, I wrote for 4 other Shopify apps. You're a Shopify app. Does that sound interesting to you? And I was like, hell yeah, it does. Let's talk. And so I think there is something to be said for kind of like building that trust, putting yourself in that in group, and also just like underrated. And I'm finding this out as a consultant, just asking what people need. That was another really successful pitch. It was warm, but they were like, what are you trying to solve right now? And I was like, here, let me grab my list of 50 things on my plate. Can you help with any of these? And they were like, yeah, I actually, I'm really good at this one thing. So I think being specific, not just launching into a pitch and making it as warm as possible is super helpful. And getting your clients to recommend you to other clients. Like if you were only working with us 15 hours a week and that's all we could give you, Anna, and you were like, hey, do you know anyone else who needs writers? I'd be putting an all call out. You know what I mean? So I think there is a lot of benefit in warming those relationships up.
Well, thank you to everyone who stuck through with us to the end. We're glad we were able to get through the questions that were out there. If you would like to get in contact with Ryan or Zach or myself, you know where to find us. And I will be, once the recording is uploaded, I will be sending that out to everyone. So thank you so much for joining us.